ransomed by their brethren, paying enormous sums for freedom, and scattered throughout Europe and Asia, carrying with them tales of terror and loss. Wherever these wandering Jews went, they bore the memory of massacre, displacement, and suffering, stories that echoed across continents and generations. The tragedy of those years left an indelible imprint upon Jewish memory and liturgy. Contemporary chroniclers like Nathan Hanover, from the town of Zaslav, recorded the horrors in his historical chronicle Yevon Metzelah, published in 1653. Another scholar, Sabbatai Cohen, from Vilna, made the catastrophe known to the wider Jewish world through a circular letter entitled Megalath Ephah, accompanied by prayers commemorating the martyrs of Poland. Leading rabbis of the era, Lippmann Heller of Krakow, Sheftel Horowitz of Posen, Meir of Szczebrzeszyn, author of Tzach HaDashidim, and Gabriel Schussberg, author of Peta Teshuvah, all composed dirges, memorial prayers, and chronicles that recounted the devastation of Jewish life in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. These writings reveal a bitter awareness that the peaceful sanctuary in which Polish Jewry had flourished for centuries had been violently destroyed, and that its restoration would be a long and arduous task. Yet the resilience of the Jewish people shone through the despair. By 1658, when relative peace returned to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the decimated communities began to rebuild. Despite the annihilation wrought by Cossack rebellion, Muscovite invasion, and Swedish conquest, the Jewish population of Poland remained numerically greater than that of all Western Europe combined. The cultural and religious center of European Jewry remained firmly in Poland, although now it occupied a more circumscribed and secluded role, reflecting the devastation of the southern regions. The vitality of Polish Jewry was soon evident in the reconstruction of destroyed communities. Survivors returned to their devastated towns and villages, cleared the rubble, rebuilt homes, and reopened their shops and workshops. They re-established their communal organizations, known as Kehillat, which oversaw local self-government, taxation, and the operation of synagogues and schools. Even amidst material ruin, religious and educational life revived with remarkable speed. King John Casimir, who had resumed the reins of government after fleeing Silesia during the Swedish invasion, sought to assist the Jewish population in recovering from their immense losses. In 1661, he issued a royal charter granting the Jews of Krakow the right to free commerce, a measure intended to restore economic stability and protect the community from further oppression. Additional privileges, such as temporary relief from certain taxes and the granting of commercial rights, were extended to other Jewish communities most affected by the Cossack rebellions and foreign invasions. These royal concessions softened, but could not completely alleviate the long-lasting effects of economic devastation. The southern regions of Poland, the original heartland of Jewish settlement, suffered disproportionately. In the Ukraine, peace remained fragile for decades. The Treaty of Andrusovo, signed in 1667, divided the territory between Poland and Muscovy. The lands on the right bank of the Dnieper, including Volhynia and Podolia, remained under Polish control, while the left bank, encompassing Poltava, Chernihiv, and part of the Kiev district, came under Muscovite rule and became known as Little Russia. The Cossacks, however, remained politically fragmented, with their leaders or hetmans frequently shifting allegiances between Poland, Russia, and even the Ottoman Empire. This persistent instability hindered agricultural recovery and trade, leaving Jewish communities impoverished and precarious. In Little Russia, Jewish life had nearly vanished, while in Polish-controlled Ukraine, Jews struggled to regain their former prosperity. The southwestern territories, once the thriving center of Polish Jewry, sank economically and demographically, gradually yielding cultural prominence to the northern regions, including Lithuania and White Russia, which had endured relatively less devastation. The shift of the Jewish cultural and religious center from the south to the north marks one of the defining features of this turbulent era. Even amidst ruin, the Jewish people demonstrated extraordinary resilience, rebuilding schools, synagogues, and communal institutions, preserving their religious scholarship and maintaining the sacred memory of those who perished. The years following 1658 testify not only to the horrors endured, but also to the extraordinary capacity for recovery, adaptation, and survival of a people determined to endure, even when the world around them had been plunged into chaos and bloodshed. Michael Vishniovetzky, who reigned as King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania from 1669 to 1673, inherited not only the crown, but also a legacy of compassion toward the Jewish population. He was the son of Jeremiah Vishniovetzky, a nobleman remembered as a hero by the Jewish communities of the Ukraine for his courageous defense of Jewish lives during the Cossack uprisings and the horrors of 1648 to 1658. King Michael, by virtue of both blood and upbringing, extended protection to the Jewish population, striving to preserve their rights and to stabilize their precarious existence after decades of turmoil. At his coronation diet, the Legislative Assembly of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, King Michael formally ratified the fundamental privileges of the Jews, ensuring their right to economic activity, communal self-government, and religious practice, so long as these privileges did not conflict with the general laws and customs of the Commonwealth. This act was achieved through the tireless efforts of Moses Markovich, the general syndic of the Jews, who acted as the spokesperson for the Kahals, the organized Jewish communities of the ancient provinces of Poland. Markovich, representing a network of Jewish councils, petitioned the crown to uphold the rights that had been so violently threatened in previous decades. Despite the benevolence of King Michael, the Diets, influenced heavily by the Catholic clergy and the Polish szlachta, the hereditary nobility, undermined the monarch's efforts. The Diet of Warsaw, convened in 1670, imposed restrictive measures on Jewish economic activity, capping interest rates at 20%, ostensibly a fair regulation, but further extending to controlling social interactions and religious freedoms. Jews were forbidden from employing Christian servants or leaving their homes during church processions, rules justified by the clerical rhetoric that accused Jews of perfidy, sacrilege, and hostility toward Christians. The venom of the Catholic Church toward Jews, deeply rooted over centuries, now found expression in these legislative measures, embedding anti-Jewish sentiment into law under the guise of moral and religious supervision. The pervasive influence of church ideology extended into education, where Christian colleges and Jesuit academies became breeding grounds for hostility toward Jewish communities. Students of these institutions, known as Schülergelof, took to the streets to harass Jewish passers-by and to instigate pogroms in Jewish quarters. Cities such as Krakow, Posen, Lemberg, Vilna, and Brest witnessed the daily manifestation of this scholastic violence. The authorities, often either unwilling or powerless to intervene, allowed these brutalities to continue unchecked. To mitigate the threat, some Jewish communities paid an annual tax, known as kazubles, to the rectors of local Catholic schools, a grim acknowledgement that their safety depended on buying temporary immunity from violence. Even such measures could not protect the Jews of Lemberg, in the province of Galicia. In 1664, pupils of the Cathedral School and the Jesuit Academy, aided by a disorderly mob, prepared to storm the Jewish quarter. Forewarned, the Jewish youth of Lemberg organized an armed defense, gathering courage and arms to protect their families and property. Yet, the ferocity of the attacking Christian students and their supporters overwhelmed the defenders. A massacre ensued. Approximately 100 Jews were slain, synagogues desecrated, and many homes destroyed. This incident, one of many in the period, illustrated the persistence of anti-Jewish sentiment and the fragility of communal safety, even under royal protection. Among the most notorious cases of medieval trials during this period were two instances that illustrate the persistence of fear and prejudice toward Jewish communities. The first took place in 1657 in the small town of Ruzhny, in the province of Dubnow, in Lithuania. During the Easter festival, local Christians placed the corpse of a child in the yard of a Jewish household, immediately accusing the entire community of ritual murder, a charge commonly known as blood libel, alleging that Jews murdered Christian children for sacramental purposes. The trial lasted nearly 3 years, a drawn-out ordeal that ended tragically with the execution of 2 leading members of the Jewish community, Rabbi Israel and Rabbi Tobias. The grief of this injustice was memorialized in a dirge composed by the son of one of the martyrs, a sorrowful and heartrending account that preserved the memory of the tragedy for future generations. These events, from the scholastic riots to the infamous ritual murder trials, demonstrate the tension and violence that pervaded Jewish life in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the latter half of the 17th century. Even under a king inclined to protection and justice, the forces of clerical influence, noble self-interest, and popular prejudice conspired to place the Jewish population in a perpetual state of danger, requiring both resilience and courage to survive. The shadows of hatred and violence that had long haunted the Jewish communities of Poland did not lift with peace or royal decrees. The echoes of persecution could still be heard in the anguished words of contemporary chroniclers, in laments that described the cruelty, the cunning, and the relentless malice of those who sought to destroy the Jewish people. One such account relates the fate of Rabbi Israel and Rabbi Tobias, 2 holy men of the Jewish community, whose lives became a testament to unwavering faith in the face of mortal danger. For 3 long years, these 2 men, along with their fellow Jews, endured the horror of false accusations. A vile rumor spread among the townsfolk, claiming that the Jews drank the blood of murdered Christians and fed upon the children of the Gentiles, a grotesque and malicious slander known as the blood libel. The accusation was treated as truth despite being utterly fabricated, and dragged the community before a hostile court. This trial was held in the week before the Jewish New Year, a time meant for reflection and prayer, yet turned instead into a spectacle of injustice. The judge, a wily and cruel man, required no witnesses or evidence, relying only on his own eyes and prejudice to pass judgment. He offered the assembled mob the unthinkable choice to select 2 Jews for execution, Rabbi Israel and Rabbi Tobias. Upright and revered leaders of the community were seized. Yet fear did not touch their hearts. Clasping hands, they resolved to face death together, to sanctify the name of God, even in the face of the sword. On the 6th day of the trial, an altar was erected in the marketplace, and the wrath of the Lord, as chroniclers described it, descended upon the innocent. Rabbi Israel lifted his head and proclaimed the Shema, the central declaration of Jewish faith. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The executioner raised his sword, and Rabbi Israel was slain. Rabbi Tobias, seeing the passing of his companion into the realm of light, followed with the same courage and devotion, and he too was murdered. The words of the martyrs echo through history, a testimony of faith and steadfastness in the most extreme adversity. In the city of Krakow, in the year 1663, another tragedy unfolded, this time involving Mattathias Kalahora, a Jewish apothecary of Italian origin. He had settled in Krakow and, with a learned and inquisitive mind, had entered into a dispute with a Dominican priest regarding religious matters. The priest, a member of the Dominican order, a Catholic monastic order devoted to preaching and the defense of the faith, invited Kalahora to a formal disputation, but the apothecary declined, offering instead to submit his arguments in writing. Shortly thereafter, the priest discovered a written statement in the German language on his chair in the church, containing a vehement critique of the veneration of the Immaculate Virgin, whether authored by Kalahora or by adherents of the Reformation or the Arian heresy. The priest insisted that Kalahora was responsible and charged him with blasphemy against the Christian faith. The court of the royal castle subjected the accused to torture, seeking a confession, yet found no proof, for Kalahora, an Italian, did not even write German. Witnesses confirmed that he conversed in Italian and could not have penned the German text. Despite this evidence, the court sentenced him to die by burning at the stake, prescribing a gruesome series of executions. First, the cutting off of the lips that had spoken blasphemy, then the burning of the hand that had held the statement, followed by the excision of the tongue, and finally the immolation of the body, whose ashes were loaded into a cannon and fired into the air. On December 13th, 1663, this barbarous sentence was carried out in the marketplace of Piotrków. For 2 centuries afterward, the Jewish community of Krakow commemorated Mattathiah Kalahora on the 14th of Kislev, reciting memorial prayers in his honor in the Old Synagogue, ensuring that the memory of his martyrdom endured. Even beyond the immediate horror, there were attempts to intervene on behalf of the Jewish victims. In Rome, on February 9, 1664, Marini, the general of the Dominican order, sent an epistle to his counterparts in Krakow, acknowledging that the Jewish population had suffered under wicked slanders and accusations designed to portray the Polish people as universally hostile to Jews. Marini instructed the local clergy to defend the Jewish population against such calumnies. Yet these warnings, noble as they were in intention, proved ineffective. The machinery of prejudice, bolstered by law, custom, and the cruelty of ordinary citizens, was far too powerful, and the Jewish communities of Poland continued to live under a constant shadow of danger. In these narratives, the martyrdom of Rabbi Israel and Rabbi Tobias, the grotesque execution of Mattathiah Kalahora, the incessant attacks by students and mobs, one sees the recurring pattern of persecution. It is a pattern shaped by fear, religious fanaticism, and a society still reeling from the devastations of war. These stories, recorded in chronicles, dirges, and liturgical prayers, echo with the tension and drama of a people tested by adversity, yet steadfast in their faith, clinging to God and to their communal bonds even as the world around them turned to chaos and cruelty. The reign of King John III Sobieski, who ruled the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth from the year 1674 until 1696, was a remarkable period in the history of Poland and of the Jewish population within its borders. John Sobieski was not only a skilled and courageous military leader, celebrated throughout Europe for his victories against the Ottoman Turks, particularly at the Great Battle of Vienna in the year 1683, but he was also a monarch who understood the value of justice and protection for all his subjects, including those who were often marginalized and persecuted. Throughout his reign, he encountered the persistent hostility of the Szlachta, the Polish nobility, whose power and influence over local affairs often translated into oppression of the less privileged, and the municipal authorities, who sometimes viewed the Jews with suspicion or contempt. The clergy, particularly the Catholic Church, maintained their historical prejudice against the Jews, accusing them of heresy, ritual offenses, or economic exploitation, often turning these accusations into instruments of persecution. King John Sobieski, fully aware of the precarious position of the Jewish population, consistently extended to them official protection and safe conducts, shielding entire Jewish communities from attack and harassment. He formally recognized their liberties and privileges, enlarged their sphere of self-government, and freed them from the jurisdiction of municipal authorities who might otherwise oppress them. For instance, in the year 1682, responding to a petition from the Jewish community of Vilna, now the capital city of Lithuania, Sobieski granted them exemption from the municipal census. The Jewish residents had been misled the previous year by the Vilna magistracy, which had promised them safety if they left the city confines to participate in the census alongside Christian trade guilds. Once outside the protection of the city walls, they were attacked by members of the guilds and other Christian inhabitants who robbed them of their clothing and possessions. The Jews were fortunate that the pupils of the local Jesuit college, in an unusual act of humanity, intervened and rescued them from complete annihilation. Meanwhile, the city magistracy looked on with what was described as great satisfaction, demonstrating the entrenched hostility that still existed even in ostensibly Christian centers of authority. Acts of mercy, however, were rare. As a rule, the students of the Catholic academies were instigators of street violence, and the disturbances in Jewish quarters were frequent and brutal. Between the years 1681 and 1682, students of the Catholic Academy of Krakow attacked Jewish residents because of their refusal to pay the Kozubles, a special tax exacted from the Jewish community to appease Christian schools. In the year 1687, a similar event occurred in the city of Posen, where the students were joined by the street mob, forcing the Jewish population to defend themselves with weapons for 3 consecutive days. The National Polish Diets, in theory, condemned such acts of violence and guaranteed the protection of Jewish lives and property, particularly when taxes or levies were being collected. In reality, these declarations were frequently ignored, and the Jews' only true protector remained the king himself. At his royal court, the general syndics, or representatives of Jewish communities throughout Poland, would present petitions for protection, restitution, or relief from abuses, and John Sobieski personally intervened whenever he could. His benevolence, however, drew criticism from powerful factions within the Senate and Diets, who viewed his defense of Jewish interests as excessive or even dangerous. A notable example occurred during the Diet held in Grodno in the year 1693. Bezalel, a prominent Jewish tax farmer and royal favorite, was accused by political enemies of desecrating the Christian religion, embezzling state funds, and committing other offenses. The king insisted that Bezalel be allowed to swear an oath clearing him of the charge of blasphemy, while the other accusations were dismissed by the Chancellor of the Exchequer. This intervention demonstrated Sobieski's unwavering commitment to protecting Jewish citizens, even in the face of entrenched opposition. During the reign of King John Sobieski, Polish Jewry gradually recovered from the devastating effects of earlier decades of warfare, rebellion, and religiously motivated attacks. Jewish communities rebuilt their homes and synagogues, re-established commerce and trade, and restored their communal self-governance, which had been disrupted during the massacres of the Cossack uprisings and the invasions of Sweden and Russia. Yet the gains achieved under Sobieski's protection were fragile and dependent entirely upon the monarch's personal authority. After his death in the year 1696, the situation for Polish Jews deteriorated under the subsequent rulers of the Saxon dynasty, Augustus II, also known as Augustus the Strong, and Augustus III, who ruled from the year 1697 to the year 1763. Under the Saxon kings, the political and social disintegration of Poland accelerated. The feudal and clerical structures that had maintained a semblance of order collapsed, leaving the country vulnerable to internal anarchy and external aggression. The legislative assemblies, known as the Diets, were easily paralyzed by the so-called liberum veto, which allowed a single deputy to dissolve proceedings and nullify decisions. Governance focused on the narrow interests of bureaucracy and nobility, and the common good was frequently ignored. In such a fragmented state, the Jews, who had previously relied on the king as a moderating force against hostile municipal authorities and noble factions, found themselves increasingly unprotected. Although Augustus II and Augustus III formally ratified traditional Jewish privileges at their coronation diets, these acts were largely symbolic. The decrees could not be enforced amid the chaos, leaving the Jewish communities vulnerable to arbitrary exactions and attacks. The Saxon kings were primarily concerned with the collection of the head tax, a levy imposed on each Jewish household or individual, and little else. At the Diet convened in Warsaw in the year 1717, which was called to restore law and order following the Swedish wars led by King Charles XII and the internal disorder that accompanied them, the Jewish population, already impoverished and weakened, faced a significant increase in this tax. Thus, the Jewish population of Poland, which had survived Cossack massacres, Russian and Swedish invasions, and religiously motivated riots, now faced the burdens of a dysfunctional government and an indifferent or hostile nobility. Their survival depended on their resilience, resourcefulness, and the occasional intervention of sympathetic authorities. But the political reality was clear. Without strong and just leadership, their legal privileges were fragile, their lives and property vulnerable, and their communities perpetually at risk from both lawlessness and prejudice. The era following Sobieski's death marked the beginning of a long period in which the Jewish population had to navigate a perilous landscape of political chaos and social hostility, laying the foundations for the challenges they would face in the 18th century. The local representatives of the government, the voyevodas and starostas, whose supposed duty was to protect the Jewish population, often became their most relentless oppressors. The voyevodas were provincial governors, and the starostas were officials responsible for the administration of towns and estates, including judicial and fiscal authority. Instead of safeguarding the Jews, these provincial satraps treated them as nothing more than sources of revenue, a target for unscrupulous extortion. Whenever a voyevoda or starosta found himself in need of money, he relied upon a simple but cruel contrivance. He demanded a fixed sum from the local kahal, the elected council governing the Jewish community. Should the kahal refuse, threats of imprisonment and other forms of violence were swiftly enacted. The process was insidious and predictable. A member of the Jewish community, often a prominent kahal elder or influential representative, would be arrested and incarcerated. Terrified, the kahal would pay the demanded sum to secure his release. Occasionally, these calculated acts of extortion were accompanied by the capricious cruelty of the official, whose savage instincts found pleasure in humiliating the victims. One notorious example occurred under the Starosta of Kaniv, a city in the Polish Ukraine. In a grotesque attempt to compensate a neighboring landowner for the murder of a Jewish tenant farmer, or a render, the Starosta ordered a number of Jews to be loaded onto a wagon and transported to the gates of the aggrieved landowner, where they were thrown down like sacks of potatoes. On another occasion, he entertained himself by forcing Jewish women to climb into an apple tree and imitate the calls of cuckoos. He then fired small shot at them, watching them fall wounded to the ground, and, laughing with macabre delight, tossed gold coins among the fallen women as if rewarding them for their suffering. These acts were not isolated incidents, but illustrative of the institutionalized cruelty that permeated the governance of Jewish communities in rural Poland. The most powerful social class in Poland, the szlachta, the nobility, prided itself on liberty, or more accurately, license, yet they extended protection to the Jews only when it suited their immediate financial or political interests. Claiming for themselves the labor of the peasants who lived on their estates, the Polish lords, or panowie, laid equal claim to the toil and financial yield of the Jewish arrenders and factors, who managed the estate's economic output and held the rights to operate local taverns or engage in liquor selling, known as propanation, turning these privileges into profitable enterprises for the landowners. At one point, the Polish landowners even attempted to legally enslave the Jews living on their estates. At the Diet of the year 1740, the deputies of the nobility submitted a resolution proposing that Jews residing on szlachta estates be recognized as hereditary subjects, effectively reducing them to the status of serfs bound to the landowners. This monstrous initiative was ultimately rejected, but not for moral reasons. The central government refused to cede the Jewish tax revenues, which would otherwise have been redirected to the pockets of the landowners. Nevertheless, in practice, the rural Jew became little more than the serf of his pan, subject to his jurisdiction and authority, whether as a businessman, a tenant farmer, or a factor managing estate affairs. The frequent conflicts between rival landowners brought ruin upon Jewish arrenders. During these territorial disputes, the Jewish managers of estates were often the primary victims of violence and confiscation. Meetings of local diets, known as dietines, conferences of the szlachta, or sessions of the court tribunals became occasions for systematic assaults on Jewish communities. Synagogues were invaded, houses ransacked, and Jewish citizens harassed or humiliated as part of the spectacle. The Diet, convened in Warsaw in the year 1717, officially condemned these wild excesses, threatening violators with fines. Yet these laws were largely ignored, and the custom of abusing the Jews remained ingrained in rural society. In the urban centers, the Jews faced continual litigation and harassment from Christian merchant guilds and trade unions, which wielded tremendous power by controlling city governments and magistracies. Competition in commerce and trade was frequently disguised as religious zeal, with Christian merchants accusing Jews of sacrilege or blasphemy to incite the city mobs against them. The Catholic clergy often encouraged these attacks, amplifying the prejudices sown by the Jesuits and other church authorities. Religious intolerance, hypocrisy, and superstition had taken deep root in Polish society, turning Jews into convenient scapegoats for the anxieties and frustrations of the population. The synods of the Catholic Church codified this hostility. At the Synod of Lavik in the year 1720, a resolution decreed that Jews should be forbidden to build new synagogues or repair existing ones, ensuring that their houses of worship would eventually decay or be destroyed by fire. 13 years later, the Synod of the year 1733, held in Plotzk, reiterated a medieval maxim that the presence of Jews in a Christian country should serve as a reminder of the torments of Christ, and that their subjugation and misery were an example of divine punishment inflicted upon infidels. Such doctrines institutionalized hatred, giving religious sanction to the daily humiliations, legal restrictions, and violence suffered by Jews across Poland. During this period, false accusations, particularly of ritual murder and blood libel, became a terrifying instrument of persecution. The lives of Jewish communities were constantly threatened by slanderous claims that they had desecrated Christian children or engaged in the most grotesque rituals. These accusations, often based on hearsay or malicious invention, could provoke entire towns to riot against their Jewish neighbors, leading to arrests, tortures, and executions without any legitimate evidence. The combination of official neglect, social envy, religious fanaticism, and legal impunity created a perilous world in which Jews lived under continuous threat, constantly navigating the dangerous currents of rural oppression, urban violence, and ecclesiastical prejudice. This atmosphere of fear, suspicion, and cruelty would define much of the 18th century in Poland, creating a society in which Jewish resilience, community cohesion, and ingenuity were the only shields against systemic oppression. It was in this context that the Jews of Poland faced not only the physical dangers of violence and robbery, but also the relentless pressures of social and legal marginalization, navigating a world where even the highest authorities were often powerless or unwilling to protect them. The close of the 17th century was a period of intense peril and anguish for the Jewish population of Poland. Religious trials became more frequent, with Jews charged repeatedly with ritual murder and the desecration of church sacraments. These accusations were born of the deep superstition and ignorance that pervaded the Catholic masses, but they were also exploited by the clerical party, which often orchestrated the evidence itself. Priests and monks would throw dead bodies into the courtyards of Jewish homes or synagogue yards, staging incidents to appear as though the Jews were guilty of monstrous crimes. Such contrivances inflamed public sentiment, emboldening mobs, and sometimes coercing local authorities to act with violence. Synagogues and cemeteries were destroyed, and Jewish communities faced expulsion, sometimes for years at a time. The cases were tried by the highest court in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Tribunal of Lublin. This court, nominally intended to administer justice impartially, often succumbed to the fervor and pressure of zealous church advocates, delivering verdicts that condemned entirely innocent people. Some of the most notorious trials took place in the towns of Sandomir between the years 1698 and 1710, Posen in 1736, and Zaslav in 1747. Each of these trials was conducted in the inquisitorial style, with the aim of extracting confessions through coercion, fear, and torture. In order to justify these travesties, Father Zakowski and his allies enlisted a convert from Judaism, Serafinovich, who claimed to have been a rabbi in Brest. Serafinovich authored a book entitled Exposure of the Jewish Ceremonies Before God and the World, published in the year 1716. This book, a chaotic mixture of delirium and deliberate lies, alleged that Jews used Christian blood in an endless array of religious and everyday practices. According to Serafinovich, Jewish households smeared Christian blood on doors to ensure favor, mixed it into the matzah eaten at Passover, soaked it in eggs for newlywed couples, and even inscribed magical formulas with it to secure commercial success. The Jewish community, outraged at this slander, challenged Serafinovich to a disputation in Warsaw in the presence of both bishops and Jewish rabbis. The meeting was arranged in the house of a high-ranking official's widow. The Jewish participants arrived, prepared to expose the falsehood of Serafinovich's claims, but he failed to appear. His absence was officially documented in an affidavit, proving the deception of his entire enterprise. Yet the damage had been done. Decades later, an anti-Semitic monk named Pekolsky of Lemberg republished Serafinovich's book in the years 1758 and 1760, using it as a weapon to incite hatred against the Jews once more. In Posen, the hostility of the local Christian population found expression through the actions of the Carmelite order. Towards the end of the 17th century, the Carmelites launched a curious and persistent lawsuit against the Jewish community, claiming that, following an alleged desecration of the Holy Hosts in the year 1399, the Jews had voluntarily pledged to accompany Christian processions as penance for their supposed sacrilege. The Jews firmly denied this allegation, and the dispute dragged through the courts for many years. In 1724, the case was finally settled, not through justice but through coercion. The Jewish community was required to provide 2 pails of oil annually to the Carmelites, ensuring that the lamp in front of the 3 holy hosts in the church remained lit. This symbolic obligation was a permanent reminder of their supposed guilt, imposed upon them by both religious authority and legal mandate. These events illustrate the precarious existence of Polish Jewry at the close of the 17th century. Ritual murder accusations, orchestrated slanders, coerced publications, and protracted lawsuits were not isolated anomalies. They were part of a systemic pattern in which the interplay of superstition, fanaticism, and institutionalized power left Jewish communities exposed to relentless persecution. In every town, in every province, the Jews lived under the constant shadow of fear, aware that their lives, their property, and their very faith could be threatened at any moment by both the zealous clergy and the envious populace. The fanaticism of the Catholic Church at the middle of the 18th century found new outlets for cruelty, and in the year 1736, the city of Posen became the stage of a ritual murder trial that lasted 4 long, harrowing years. Everything was orchestrated in advance, in accordance with the imagined rites and ceremonies of the church zealots. The discovery of the dead body of a Christian child in the vicinity of the city set the machinery of accusation into motion. The authorities also relied on the testimony of a Polish beggar woman, who, under the unbearable pressure of torture, confessed to having sold the child to the elders of the Jewish community of Posen. With this coerced statement in hand, the local magistrates made the first arrests. Among those arrested were the preacher, or Dershon, Arilib Kalahora, a direct descendant of the martyr Mattathiah Kalahora, whose own death had become a legend of courage. The Kahal elder, also called Parnas or Syndic, Jacob Pinkasevich, son of Phineas, and several other members of the administrative council of the Jewish community, known as the Kahal. Panic swept through the Jewish population, and many fled from Posen, seeking to escape the inexorable fury of the inquisitors. On the eve of his arrest, Kalahora chose for the text of his Sabbath discourse a passage from the book of Numbers, chapter 23, verse 10. Who can count the dust of Jacob and the number of the 4th part of Israel? Let me die the death of the righteous. With profound foreboding, he explained the verse as a lament for the countless Jews who had been burned and quartered for the faith of Israel. Surrounded by a small gathering of his community, he asked them to recite, for the last time, the prayer Borku, or Praise the Lord of Praise, a final act of spiritual solidarity before the darkness that awaited him. The forebodings of Kalahora proved tragically accurate. He and the elder Jacob Pinkasevich did not survive the brutal tortures of cross-examination. The preacher's bones were broken, his flesh scorched, and yet he did not recant. The elder, forced to hold a lamp to light the executioner's work, endured agony until death claimed him in the autumn of the year 1736. The Jewish deputies of Posen petitioned King Augustus III, ruler of Poland and elector of Saxony, appealing against the cruelty and blatant bias of the municipal court. Their pleas resulted in the transfer of the case to a special royal judicial commission composed of officials loyal to the crown. Even under the commission, torture was employed as an instrument of interrogation, but the accused maintained their innocence. The judges, already convinced of Jewish guilt, nevertheless sentenced them to death by burning at the stake, along with the bodies of Kalahora and Pinkasevich, which had to be exhumed for this gruesome purpose. The ratification of this sentence depended on the king himself. The Jewish representatives, both in Warsaw, the capital of Poland, and Dresden, the secondary residence of the monarch and seat of the papal nuncio, exerted every possible effort to prevent the execution. Augustus III, a dull-witted monarch, notorious for a certain ingrained anti-Semitism, proved difficult to sway. Yet the combined pressure of public opinion and the intervention of influential Jewish bankers in Vienna, especially the powerful banking house of Wertheimer, compelled him to reconsider. After prolonged deliberations and a second revision by the Royal Commission, the king issued orders to release the imprisoned Jews in August of the year 1740. Even in triumph, the Jewish community was reminded of their precarious position. King Augustus III, in his royal decree, issued a series of medieval-style regulations. The Jews were not to leave the boundaries of their ghetto too frequently, not to associate with Christians, not to caress Christian children, not to employ Christian domestics, and not to attend to Christian patients. These restrictions, while preserving their lives, perpetuated the stigma imposed upon them by centuries of superstition and fanaticism. The outcome of the Posen trial was exceptional, aided by the size and influence of the Jewish community, which could mobilize attention across Europe. In smaller, more remote towns, such as Zaslav and Volhynia, the ritual murder accusations were nothing less than horrific nightmares. In the spring of the year 1747, when the snow was melting, the body of a Christian was discovered in a neighboring village, buried beneath the winter snow. By coincidence, at the same time, the functionaries of the Zaslav synagogue gathered in a nearby Jewish inn to celebrate the circumcision of the newborn son of the innkeeper. A peasant passing by witnessed the gathering and reported to the authorities that the Jews had spent the entire night praying, eating, and celebrating. The Bernardine monks of Zaslav, notorious for their religious zealotry, interpreted this innocent celebration as proof of ritual murder. The Jewish innkeeper, the Kahal elder, the Hazan or cantor, the Mohel or ritual circumciser, and the synagogue beadle, a young man named Moishi, were all indicted. Despite the application of excruciating torture, they insisted that they had been gathered only to celebrate a circumcision. The young beadle, Moishi, temporarily driven to delirium by the tortures, murmured words dictated by his interrogators, though he later withdrew the coerced confession. The sentences imposed upon the accused were monstrous, reflecting a cruelty possible only among barbarians. Some were placed upon an iron pail, a device that slowly cut into their bodies, causing excruciating prolonged death. Others were subjected to equally horrifying tortures. Their skin torn in strips, their hearts cut from their chests, their hands and feet amputated and nailed to the gallows. The memory of these martyrs was preserved in the prayers of the community, concluding with the biblical plea, "O earth, cover not thou their blood, and let their cry have no place, until the Lord shall look down from heaven." The terror of ritual murder trials, the arbitrariness of torture, and the grotesque ingenuity of human cruelty combined to make these decades a period of near-apocalyptic suffering for the Jews of Poland. Each accusation, each trial, each execution was a chilling reminder of how superstition, fanaticism, and institutional power could converge to strike fear into the hearts of an entire people. The cries of the martyrs of Zaslav were quickly swallowed by the clamorous shouts of new victims, for the myth of ritual murder had infected the minds of the Christian populace like a poisonous wind, turning ordinary men and women, whether consciously or unconsciously, into instruments of cruelty and, at times, cannibalistic frenzy. The accusation became a recurring nightmare, haunting the Jewish communities of Poland with an almost annual frequency for the next 15 years. Each new trial, each new allegation, was like a thunderclap of terror, echoing across villages, towns, and cities, leaving destruction, fear, and death in its wake. The trials were relentless, and among the most appalling were those of Dunagrad in the year 1748, Pavolochi and Zhytomyr in the year 1753, Yampol in the year 1756, Stupnitsa near Przemysl in the year 1759, and Voislovica near Lublin in the year 1760. In the case of Zhytomyr, 24 Jews were accused of murdering a peasant boy by the name of Studzienski. Exhausted by the excruciating tortures administered by the authorities and spurred by the unbearable pain and the desire to hasten their deaths, the accused confessed to crimes they had never committed. 11 of them were flayed alive, their flesh torn while they yet lived, while the others were given a perverse choice: salvation through baptism, renouncing their faith to preserve their lives. The clergy then propagated the image of the alleged martyr Studzienski, a grotesque figure covered with pins, spreading it throughout the region to inflame hatred and cement the belief in the ritual murder libel. In the town of Voislovica, the Jewish community was accused en masse of murdering a Christian boy to obtain his blood for the preparation of unleavened bread, central to the Jewish observance of Passover. The spiritual leaders and elders of the community were dragged to court. One of the accused, a rabbi, driven to despair, committed suicide in prison, while 4 others were sentenced to be quartered. Yet the priests, cunning in their cruelty, promised leniency if the victims converted to Christianity. The victims, weakened and terrorized by their tortures, accepted the offer, and instead of being quartered, they were beheaded, a mercy in its own horrific context. The unending terror of these inquisitorial trials prompted the Jewish communities of Poland to act collectively. In the year 1758, they chose Jacob Zelig, also known as Selek, to serve as their emissary to Rome, carrying their desperate plea to the Pope Benedict XIV. Zelig's petition detailed the unbearable plight of the Jews of Poland. As soon as a dead body is found anywhere, the Jews of the neighboring localities are dragged before the courts on charges of murder for superstitious purposes, he wrote. The petition reached Cardinal Ganganelli, later Pope Clement XIV, who took the matter seriously. He instructed the papal nuncio in Warsaw, Viscani, to submit a detailed report of all recent ritual murder trials in Poland. Ganganelli, through painstaking investigation, prepared an elaborate memorandum demonstrating that the charges were entirely baseless, echoing the condemnations issued by earlier popes, particularly Pope Innocent IV, whose bull of the year 1247 had categorically denounced such accusations. The memorandum was examined and endorsed by the Tribunal of the Holy Inquisition in Rome and forwarded to the newly elected Pope Clement XIII. The Pope instructed his nuncio in Warsaw to extend his personal protection to Jacob Zelig upon his return to Poland. The nuncio then informed the Polish Prime Minister Heinrich von Brühl that the Holy See, after thorough investigation, had found no evidence supporting the superstition that Jews required human blood for the preparation of unleavened bread. King Augustus III ratified, in the year 1763, the ancient charters of his predecessors, promising the Jews legal protection in all cases related to ritual murder. Yet the prejudice was deeply ingrained in Polish society, resisting eradication. Even educated observers, such as the contemporary writer Kitowicz, could not escape the toxic influence, remarking bitterly, "Just as the liberty of the Szlachta is impossible without the liberum veto, so Is the Jewish matzah impossible without Christian blood? Amidst this atmosphere of religious and social fanaticism, the country itself was crumbling. The once flourishing Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, undermined by the corruption of its classes, the tyranny of the clergy, and the unbridled independence of the Szlachta, was moving inexorably toward ruin. When Stanislav Augustus Poniatowski ascended the throne of Poland in the year 1764, the nation was, for all practical purposes, under the protective hand of the Russian Empire. Some elements of Polish society began to recognize that only sweeping reforms could save the kingdom from impending disintegration. Yet the entrenched fanaticism of both the social and religious orders seemed too decrepit to deliver a death sentence upon itself, and the fate of the nation appeared destined to be determined by forces outside its own control. The first years of the reign of Stanislav Augustus Poniatowski, elected King of Poland in the year 1764, saw the machinery of Polish politics churning along in its familiar, lethargic groove. The Polish government, rather than attempting to improve the condition of the Jewish population, which formed one of the most vital elements of the urban centers, thought only of exploiting them as a source of revenue for the royal treasury. The Diet of 1764, which had been convened in Warsaw prior to the coronation of the king to discuss internal reforms, gave scant thought to improving the situation of the Jews. The only adjustment they deemed necessary concerned the system of Jewish taxation, the so-called head tax or podatek glony, which had previously been levied as a single round sum upon all Polish and Lithuanian Jews. This sum had been apportioned among the separate Jewish communities, or kahals, by the central Jewish governing bodies known as the wads, or Jewish councils, which then distributed the amount among the individual members of their communities. Under the new regulations, however, each Jewish individual was required to pay 2 gulden annually, and the kahals were held strictly responsible for collecting the tax accurately. This change, while presented as reform, in truth increased the overall burden upon the Jews, at a time when many avenues of livelihood were being closed to them by the municipal authorities and trade guilds. The Szlachta, the Polish nobility whose privileges rested upon personal freedom and the exploitation of lower estates, watched over their class interests with fervor. In electing King Stanislav Augustus, they imposed upon him the requirement that the Jews be barred from the management of royal estates, the collection of state taxes, and the handling of other financial revenues. To gratify the hereditary competitors of the Jews, the Christian burghers and urban merchants, the Diet of 1768 restored a clause from the parliamentary constitution of the year 1538. By this provision, the Jews of cities that had not received specific privileges could engage in commerce only with the consent of the municipal authorities, which were dominated by those same Christian merchants and burghers. Meanwhile, in the Russian-populated portion of the Ukrainian lands on the right bank of the river Dnieper, still nominally under Polish sovereignty, unrest was stirring. A popular movement arose, directed simultaneously against both the Poles and the Jews. Its roots lay in the memories of the enslaved village peasants, known as khlops, who had endured centuries of feudal servitude. They had not forgotten the terrible years of the Cossack uprising led by Bogdan Khmelnytsky, during which peasants and Cossacks alike had risen against the Polish pans and their Jewish stewards. That collective memory of vengeance and bloodshed lay dormant in the Ukrainian countryside, only to resurface in moments of political instability, which were frequent in the decaying Polish state. The insurgent forces, known as haidamaks, often consisted of fugitive Greek Orthodox peasants, Zaporozhian Cossacks, and other itinerant groups from the Russian lands. They organized themselves into independent detachments, raiding the estates of Polish nobles and plundering Jewish communities. These raids were not mere banditry, but were framed as acts of revenge and religious zeal, and during periods of interregnum or political uncertainty, they often assumed the character of full-scale insurrections. In the years 1734 and 1750, detachments of haidamaks, fully organized under experienced Cossack leaders, devastated towns and villages in the provinces of Kiev, Volhynia, and Podolia, killing and looting indiscriminately, targeting both Polish nobles and Jewish inhabitants alike. The Haydamak uprising of the year 1768 was particularly ferocious. The Russian government, which by this period exercised near-complete control over Polish affairs, demanded that the Greek Orthodox dissidents be granted full religious freedom and political equality. This demand incensed a significant portion of the Polish Szlachta and the Catholic clergy, who seceded from the pro-Russian Polish government and formed the Confederacy of Bar, a political and military alliance dedicated to defending the ancient Polish social and religious order against foreign influence. While the royal and Russian forces engaged the Confederates, discontent among the Greek Orthodox peasants of the Polish-Ukrainian territories intensified. Agitators, drawn from the Orthodox clergy and Zaporozhian Cossacks, stirred the peasants to rise against the Poles, portraying the Confederates as oppressors seeking the annihilation of the Orthodox faith. Adding fuel to the fire, a forged decree, attributed to the Russian Empress Catherine II and known as the Golden Charter, was circulated widely. It commanded the people to exterminate the Poles and the Jews, the desecrators of our holy religion, further inflaming the masses and providing a divine justification for the violence. The Haydamak uprising was led by the formidable Zaporozhian Cossack Maxim Zalesniak, known in history as Zalesniak, whose forces began their campaign in April of the year 1768. The insurgents swept across the government of Kiev, murdering Polish nobles, Jewish businessmen, and entire families, leaving towns and estates in ruin. Their cruelty was notorious. It was common for a single tree to bear the bodies of a Pole, a Jew, and a dog, accompanied by an inscription reading, Lack, Zhyd, and Hound, all to the same faith bound, a terrifying message of religious and social hatred. Among the most gruesome massacres were those perpetrated in the towns of Lysyanka and Tediev, in the province of Kiev, where scores of Jews were slaughtered, their homes looted, and their communities left in flames, marking one of the darkest chapters in the history of Polish Jewry. From the burning streets of Uman, the terror rippled outward like wildfire. Zalesniak and Ganta, commanding the Haydamak forces, moved with terrifying swiftness and precision, spreading horror through the surrounding towns and villages. Uman itself, a fortified town of strategic importance on the Polish-Ukrainian frontier, had been swarming with tens of thousands of refugees long before the Haydamaks arrived. The new arrivals, fleeing the growing unrest, found no room within the city walls and were forced to camp in hastily pitched tents in the open, exposed to the elements and the fear that gripped them like a vice. The town of Uman belonged to the estate of the voivoda of Kiev, a high-ranking provincial governor who was a member of the illustrious Potocki family, one of the most powerful noble dynasties of Poland. The military defense of the town had been entrusted to Governor Mladenovic, who commanded a detachment of Cossacks drawn from the court guard under Colonel Andrei Ivanovich Ganta. Ganta, however, had long been suspected of sympathizing with the Haydamak insurgents, a suspicion that would prove tragically justified. When Zalesniak's forces approached, Ganta betrayed his post and joined the insurgent army. On the 18th day of June, 1768, the two commanders, Zalesniak and Ganta, led their combined forces toward Uman, their hearts set on destruction. The defenders of Uman, a coalition of Polish noblemen and Jewish townspeople, fought valiantly during the first day, manning the city walls and firing cannon and rifles against the attackers. But fear and betrayal had already seeped into the city. Many Poles were more concerned with saving their own lives than defending their homes. Governor Mladenovic, seeking to preserve his own safety, entered into peace negotiations with the Haydamaks. He was reassured that the insurgents would spare the Polish nobles and concentrate their wrath on the Jews. Once Zalesniak and Ganta penetrated the town, the Jews were immediately subjected to the most unspeakable horrors. They were driven through the streets, trampled by horses, thrown from rooftops, impaled on bayonets, and subjected to systematic sexual violence. A crowd of approximately 3,000 Jews sought refuge in the great synagogue of Yuman, their sacred house of prayer. A few courageous men armed with knives and daggers mounted a desperate resistance, killing several attackers. The majority, however, could do nothing but pray for divine deliverance. The Haidamaks brought a cannon to the entrance of the synagogue, and with a thunderous blast,